DNA profiling has been around since the 1980s, but why did it take the Kansas City Police Department 31 years to solve the murder of Fawn Cox? Let's explore that together. Hello, I'm Sean, and if you're new here, welcome to my channel. If you are returning, then it's great to see you again. Twice a week, I research true crime that I find interesting to tell to you. I want to make sure that the victims are being remembered. There's a lot of different victims out there to remember. As I always say, we all know the name Ted Bundy, but we don't know any of his victims. And it should be the other way around. We should know the victims and not care about the killer. If you're not subscribed, please do so. It's free. But if you also want a membership for other benefits, that's an option too. If you ever have any ideas for a true crime for me to do in the future, please feel free to leave a message. Now on with today's true crime. Fawn Cox was your average 16-year-old in 1989. She was born March 24th, 1973 in Kansas City, Missouri. She lived near East 9th Street and Van Burnt Boulevard in a two-story home with her parents and her sisters, Amber and Felisa. I'm hoping that I pronounced Felisa's name right. If I didn't, I'm sorry. Fawn was going to be starting her junior year at Northeast High School and was working her summer job at Worlds of Fun to try to, make extra money for the family. She was just a cashier there, but still, it was a job. It was July 26, 1989, and she worked her shift until 11 p.m. One source said 10, but every other source said 11, so I'm assuming it was 11. She went home and straight to bed as she had to work the next day. Her mom and her sister picked her up from work and brought her home. In the morning, her alarms went off around 9 o'clock, but she never turned it off. Felisa and her mom, Beverly, went upstairs to wake her. Felisa shook her and told her to get up, but she was gone. She was deceased, but how and why was the big question at that time. The ambulance was called, but there was too many hours gone that they could do anything to save her. The medical examiner determined that she died of strangulation. She was also assaulted sexually. Normally, she would have been sharing that bedroom with her sister Amber, but Amber was gone for the night. Felisa slept downstairs, taking advantage of the air conditioner. There was no air conditioning upstairs, so they left the window open. The air conditioner was noisy, and they think that was part of the thing that covered up any sounds. Felisa did state that her dog was a little uneasy over the night, but she thought it was just due because the dog was pregnant. Police investigated the scene and noticed that there was a trailer parked near the upstairs window in the back, I believe. And because of the heat, like I said, and lack of air conditioning upstairs, the windows were left open to get some breeze. So the police believe that the perpetrator or perpetrators used that to get into the house. In the bedroom, the police found traces of blood and semen on the bed sheets, and they took that into evidence. It was also noted that some items had been taken from the home. Radios, a Nintendo game console, and a stereo recorder. Now, I'm assuming those were all up on the upstairs, and I don't know if they went downstairs too. I don't know that part. One last thing that the police located was an army hat that none of the family recognized. Could this have been left by the culprit? Unfortunately, This is the only mention of the Army cap that I found anywhere. We never get back to that. The police started questioning people that knew Fawn, and they questioned neighbors to see if they saw anything. This was not a great part of town, but you know, the one question was, how did the perpetrator find their way around in the home and get around the home undetected? After a month of searching and interviews, the police finally had something. Information found stated that three teenagers were involved. They were brought in for questioning, and the police searched their homes. The three denied doing anything to Fawn, even though some of the stolen items were located in one of the teens' homes. All three were initially charged with murder, but then nothing really came out of it from the evidence, and the only eyewitness recanted their testimony and refused to cooperate with the police anymore. Also, the blood and semen and hair that was collected at the crime scene did not match any of these subjects. Now, one of the teens did admit to breaking into the Cox home and that he threw a tape recorder out of the window and it broke. He stated that he took the handle that broke off and hid it under a bush, which the police corroborated. But then he recanted and refused to cooperate anymore. A lot of recanting with these kids. All in all, one of the teens served 8 months in jail for stealing from the Cox home. But then the police closed the investigation. I could not find why the police just closed the investigation fully. I mean, it was still a murder and our case, but they closed it. Although DNA had been tested and used in some criminal cases, with Fawn's case, the genetic database didn't even exist at that time. At this time in 1989, they had to run the DNA versus another DNA. There was no like DNA database. In the early 2000s, CODIS was going strong. In 1990, the FBI started to build a DNA database, which they called CODIS. They started to actually use it in 1998. But the database, it wasn't just like a random database. It was any criminal that got taken in, they would put it in there. So they just had a database of criminals. So if somebody wasn't a criminal or hadn't gone to jail for anything, they would not be in that database. So it was still very iffy at that time. Prior to this, though, they could match one DNA to another. So if they had that, they could do it that way. The DNA in Fawn's case was ran, but there were no matches. But this got the experts to start thinking about it. They brought the three suspects from the robbery back in. Of course, none of them matched it. They were guilty of stealing, but not of murdering Fawn. And unless there was a fourth guy that they weren't talking about, it was a dead end again. This was really devastating news to the Cox family. They felt like the murderer was never going to be found. Now we fast forward to 2018 when DNA research had improved immensely. Hundreds of cases were being solved with new analysis tools. But even with these advancements, the Kansas City Police Department was not reopening Fawn's case. So the family took matters into their own hands. They started fundraising and offered a reward for anyone that could provide some detail. They really received so many donations, and they raised the funds to actually do the testing. And they wanted to get the testing taken care of. But they got stopped by a brick wall. The police department declined the use of the money that the family raised, and they refused to run any tests. They said this would cause a dilemma that only people that could afford it would get their cases solved by this process, and they said that it would not be fair to other families that couldn't afford it. And I mean, I understand that, but from my understanding, the Cox family wasn't well to do, so they raised up the money. Rich donors gave to it to try to find this out. So I mean, if they could do it, that means other people could have done it. And at this time, only a handful of labs could run these tests. Some still figured that if a rich and powerful person was murdered, they would have gotten to jump to the front of the line. And I probably can't disagree with that reasoning. Yeah, I can't disagree at all with that. Finally, in late 2020, the FBI decided to provide funding for Fawn's samples to be tested at the lab. The FBI is higher up than Kansas City Police Department, so they took over. The lab focused on the semen sample, and they got a hit. They notified the family on November 10th. Both of her parents were still living, so they got the news that they had been waiting for 31 years. Though the news was very bittersweet. The test revealed that Donald Cox was the killer. He was 21 at the time of her death, and her cousin. Fawn's father's brother's son. Yeah. This was just a chance happening to find out it was him. Donald died in 2006 due to a drug overdose. His death was looked at as if there might have been some foul play, so they collected a blood DNA sample just for evidence, but then they figured out that it was just an overdose, and they stopped looking for a subject, and his DNA just sat there. Finding out who the killer was still didn't settle well with the police. They had evidence that the 3 teens were in the home too. But were they in there at a different time than Donald, or at the same time? Did they know Donald? I mean, we're never going to really know unless one of the teens, who are not teens anymore, come forward and say, yeah, he was with us or something like that. But you figure that they were being looked at as the murderers, that they might actually come forward and say, no, it's that guy. This was the first murder case that the Kansas City Police Department solved using advanced genetic genealogy techniques. Fawn's sister, Felisa, told CBS News, "It's a real relief there's closure. The answers aren't always what we are asking for, but there's closure." I think that in a case like this, that's all that anyone can ask for. There's so many cases out there that are unsolved, and their family and friends just want to know something, and it really saddens and sickens me that they get no answers. I've done so many cases where family members pass away before getting any closure. It's the not knowing that really gets to a person. All the questions that arise that are not answered, and even though the families say that they have closure now, one can't wonder, why did Donald do this? He was a cousin, and he was in and out of the house so often. And after she was murdered by him, how could he come back into the house and act like nothing happened? It's confusing. At 16, you have your whole life ahead of you. On July 26, 1989, I had just turned 17. I think about all the things I've done since that day to today, and all the things that Fawn never got to do. It really, really saddens me. I'm so sorry, Fawn. May you rest in peace. My heart goes out to her family and her friends and everyone that loved her. I did reach out to Felisa and I got her permission to do this story. So thank you very much for giving me that honor. Thank you very much for looking at my script before I read it. So that being said, thank you for watching. If you're not subscribed, please do so. Be good to yourself. Be good to others. I love you all. I'll see you next time.